Hello, students, and welcome to lecture notes for Ancient Egypt and Kush. The two main civilizations in the Nile were Ancient Egypt and Kush. Egypt was located in the north, which is also known as Lower Egypt because it's downriver, and Kush is located in the south, or Upper Egypt, because it was upriver. Settlement in this region began around 4800 BCE, and the Nile River was a perfect place because there was excellent farming soil thanks to the flooding. The region was also called Kemet, which means the black land. This is because when the floods came, it brought with it rich silt, which was excellent for growing things. The difference here, too, between ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia is that flooding was very predictable in ancient Egypt. Flooding would usually reach the Aswan area by late June. It would peak by September. Whereas in Mesopotamia, which we learned about in our last lessons, was very unpredictable. So these predictable floods allowed for irrigation by Egyptian farmers who would divert the floodwaters into floodplains using canals. The most important geographical feature of Egypt is the Nile River. The Nile is the longest river in the world, and it's around 4,100 miles long. It splits in the south between the Blue Nile, which goes into the eastern mountains, and the White Nile, which goes into the central tropics. Along the Upper Nile, there are the steep cliffs which create cataracts or waterfalls and rapids. These waterfalls were very important because it helped protect Egypt because it made it impossible to travel in some areas of the river. In the northern part, right along the Mediterranean Sea where the sea and the river meet, is the Nile Delta. This area is a marshy delta, which also provided some protection because people weren't able to attack from the sea, as most of the major cities were a little further inland. Unlike ancient Mesopotamia, geography really worked to help protect Egypt. As I mentioned, cataracts to the south made it difficult to travel up and down the river, so invading armies couldn't just hop in their boats and sail down the Nile, attacking as they went. To the east and west were barren deserts. You have the Libyan Desert to the west and the Eastern Desert to the east. This made it also difficult for invading armies to enter and attack Egypt. And of course, in the Delta marshlands, as I said before, it protected Egypt from sea invasions. And so, as you can see from the picture on the right here, there's a big difference between the area closest to the river, where there's plenty of water and growth, and then the deserts to the east and west. It's said that the change from the fertile areas close to the river to the deserts is so abrupt that you could stand with one foot in fertile grasslands and another foot in sandy deserts. So geography played a very important part in the development of Egypt. Geography provided protection. There was not many fears that Egypt was going to be attacked. This allowed Egypt to grow up peacefully and become a very strong civilization. The other way that geography was able to help the development of Egypt is the seasonal, predictable floods. These were far less destructive than in Mesopotamia, which we said was very unpredictable and very destructive. Farmers could plan for their planting season. They could utilize the thick silt deposits that would come from the flooding of the Nile. They knew when the Nile would flood, and therefore they knew when they could plant their crops. They used shadoofs to collect water from the Nile for farming. They grew wheat and barley and flaxseed. They also used papyrus, which grew along the Nile River, and they were able to make things like rope, sandals, baskets, raft, and a paper-like product that they were able to write on. Because the river was so predictable, they were able to create large surpluses, which would lead to trade, as we discussed in class and in other lectures. Trade was often done with Nubia to the south, in the Kush region, and trade and farming led to needs for government. You needed large organizations to help build irrigation, to help store grain. In famines, they needed someone to help distribute food. And so villages started to join into larger areas, into small kingdoms, and eventually this is going to lead to Egyptian civilization. The first main Egyptian leader that we're going to talk about is King Narmer. He was a king of Upper Egypt, and slowly he started incorporating areas from Lower Egypt into his kingdom. Eventually, he married a princess from Lower Egypt, and he decided to establish his capital in the city of Memphis, and this was right on the border of Upper and Lower Egypt. So Narmer really was the first one to unite Egypt into one large country, and he established the first dynasty. Following King Narmer's dynasty, there would be dozens of other dynasties, and Egyptian civilization would last for over 3,000 years. The first period is called the Old Kingdom. This lasted from around 2600 to 2200 BCE, or the 3rd through 6th dynasties. When people think about Egypt and they think about pyramids and pharaohs, often they're thinking about the Old Kingdom period of Egypt. During this period, increases were seen in trade, there were large grand cities built, and you had a unified government. During this period, Egypt also turned into a theocracy, with the pharaoh as the center of the power. Pharaoh actually comes from the word that means great house, and originally pharaoh signified the royal palace, but eventually it began to be used as a reference to the king himself. And during this period, the pharaoh had the power. He appointed the bureaucrats that helped run Egypt. He owned much of the land, and he was also the religious leader of Egypt. The main architectural feature that people think about when they think of Egypt is usually the pyramids. Pyramids were built during this Old Kingdom portion of Egyptian history. Pyramids were the tombs where the pharaohs were laid to rest. And many people would wonder, why would so many people spend so much time building these giant tombs to one person? Well, the reason behind that is that they believed the pharaoh was divine. He came from the gods. And so they built these tombs for him because he was a living embodiment of the gods. Inside the pyramids, they would bury with him personal belongings, weapons, jewelry, furniture, so that he could use it in the afterlife. Basically everything he might need in his next life. The pyramids took years and years to build. Thousands of workers constructed these over that time period. Peasants at the time were required to work for a certain period, often when the Nile was flooding. But slave labor was also used to construct the pyramids. In order to properly construct the pyramids, it required a number of advanced methods, including things like astronomy, which lined the pyramids up to certain formations in the sky. It required calendars, mathematics, geometry, and a lot of engineering skills. The biggest is the pyramids of Giza. The largest one there is over 500 feet tall. It includes over 2 million blocks. To get an idea of how big it is, it's the equivalent of 9 football fields, and it's over 4,000 years old. The pyramids at Giza actually are a larger complex. In fact, it includes 3 major pyramids where pharaohs were buried, but also the Sphinx, various religious temples, funeral areas, and so the original complex was much larger than just the pyramids themselves. Pyramids also evolved over time. You have the more rudimentary pyramids, the step pyramids, which are not as flat and smooth going up the side, and eventually they refined their methods to provide a smoother pyramid like the ones at Giza. The interior of the pyramids were for the burial of the pharaoh himself. Usually there was an entrance that would go in, there might be an unfinished chamber or a decoy, and then a large grand gallery that headed up to the king's chamber where the king, the pharaoh, and all of his belongings were laid to rest. And if you're ever in Egypt, there are limited tours available, so you can go inside some of these pyramids and see what the insides of them look like. Many you'll find hieroglyphics carved into the walls or statues and things like that. If you go inside the Great Pyramid at Giza, you'll be able to go into that grand gallery that I was speaking of. It's very narrow. It's not for people who don't like small and enclosed places. The final picture I have here is some daredevils who decided to climb to the tops of the pyramids. This is highly illegal. This is not something that you are supposed to do. It's very dangerous and it could damage the pyramid itself. But some people did do this and they took some pictures. As you can see off in the distance, that's the city of Cairo. Lots of lights, lots of city and buildings. And then right across the river into on the other side of the Nile, you have the complex for the pyramids. If you remember from our unit on Mesopotamia, the afterlife in Mesopotamia was believed to be very similar to the real world, only more dull. In ancient Egypt, the afterlife was different. It was considered to be a positive experience, so the afterlife was viewed as better than the current world. To help people prepare for their journey to the afterlife, they used the Book of the Dead. The Book of the Dead was a scroll which had information that people needed in order to move from one world to the next. It was originally believed that only pharaohs were able to go to the afterlife, but religious ideas changed over time, and eventually everyone was thought to be able to move on to the afterlife. Because everyone was eventually thought to move on to the afterlife, the technique of embalming bodies to preserve them got more advanced over time. Since Egyptian civilization spanned hundreds and thousands of years, the ideas of what happened to the soul after it died changed over time. However, one of the main stories is that after the person died, their soul would make their way toward the Hall of Truths. They'd be accompanied by Anubis, who is the jackal-headed god and guide of the dead. The soul would then wait in line with the others who had died, who were also waiting for judgment by Osiris. The soul would make the negative confession in front of Osiris and a number of other gods and judges. The negative confessions are a list of 42 sins that someone could commit. And so they would say all of these things. They would confess and say things like, I have not stolen, or I have not stolen property of a god, and I have not said lies, and I have not caused anyone to weep. And there were 42 of these different sins that they could commit. Once they had told and confessed to these things, if the confession was acceptable, then the soul would present his heart or her heart to Osiris to be weighed in the golden scales against the white feather of truth. If one's heart was found to be lighter than the feather, one got to move on to the next phase. If the heart was heavier, then the heart was thrown to the floor and eaten by the female devourer of the dead. This resulted in the Great Death, which was non-existence. So one thing to remember, in Egyptian afterlife, there is no idea of hell. There is just the afterlife. Non-existence was considered worse than that. If the soul passed through the weighing of the hearts, it moved on to the path which led to the Lily Lake. On the way to the shores, there's a few different stories. Sometimes the person was able to just go straight to the shores, but sometimes they would find dangers that they had to avoid, and gods would come and help guide them through this journey. At the shore of the lake, Lily Lake, the soul would meet the divine ferryman. This person would ferry them across the lake. Unfortunately, the ferryman was very unpleasant, and the soul would have to find a way to be courteous to him no matter what kind of cruel remark he might make to them. And so that could be very challenging. Once they passed this test, the soul was brought across the waters to the Field of Reeds. Once you arrived at the Field of Reeds, this was where you would find your loved ones who had passed on before you, possibly even your favorite pets and dogs and cats and things like this. You'd find your home there just the way you had left it in the real world. And this is where you would live in eternity with your family and your loved ones. For the body after death, as we've spoken, there was an embalming process, and of course most people relate the idea of ancient Egypt to mummies. So mummies were a way to preserve and dry the body, and most often they were placed in some sort of sarcophagus. So for the higher classes, these sarcophagus would be very, very ornate, and oftentimes they would include inscriptions known as coffin text. In this image here, you see a picture of a sarcophagus that is very detailed and decorated. You can see writing on the side. That would be those coffin texts I was mentioning. And these texts usually express the hopes that the dead would be reunited with their family in the afterlife. After the body was mummified, it would be placed inside the sarcophagus. So this image here shows a sarcophagus like the one that we just looked at, but where the top has been taken off. So inside, if you look closely along the shoulders, you can see the bandages that go down the body. On top of the face, you have this decorated faceplate, and down the body, you have a variety of decorations here for this person. This final photo is a picture of a mummy who'd been partially unwrapped. So when archaeologists found mummies, they sometimes wondered what was inside. And nowadays we have x-rays and different scans that we can do to give us an idea without unwrapping them. But in previous periods before these things existed, sometimes they would just unwrap them. This particular mummy is located in the Vatican Museums, which is in Vatican City in Rome. This is a woman from Thebes, somewhere around 1070 to 945 BCE. She's very, very well preserved. If you look closely, you can see her hair is kind of a reddish color, and you can see her hands and feet are slightly exposed. The result of all of this mummification and embalming was an increase in medical skills. You learned a lot about the body through the embalming process. And so Egypt had a lot of advancements in the field of medicine. For example, they were the first to use splints, bandages, and compresses. They were also able to set bones and stitch cuts. One final thing they were known for is they wrote the first medical books. We use the word books, but at the time there weren't books. These were papyrus scrolls with information written upon them. So medical skills in ancient Egypt was pretty advanced compared to other societies at the time. Related to life and death was also the idea of religion. Egyptian religion played a very central role in the life of everyday Egyptians. Everything was thought of as an act of the gods, from the rivers flooding to the crop production. It was all controlled by the gods. The gods controlled forces of nature. And therefore, some of the most important gods were the gods that related to nature, such as Ra, the sun god, and Hapi, the river god, because the sun and the river were very important in producing the crops. Other important gods were Osiris and Isis, who ruled the world of the dead. But as I mentioned before, Egypt lasted a very long time. So gods would become popular and other gods would become less popular and change over time. So for example, Osiris and Isis dealt with the land of the dead, but eventually during the Middle Kingdom, they were replaced by Anubis. So Osiris became less popular and Anubis became more popular. And in this picture, we have some depictions of some of the gods. This here, we have Osiris and Isis. As I mentioned before, Osiris and Isis dealt with the land of the dead. Osiris had the symbolization of death and resurrection. And so that linked to the idea of planting grain, so planting and growing related to Osiris. The story behind Osiris was that Osiris was believed to have been murdered by his brother Seth, and they cut his body into pieces and spread them out around Egypt. Isis was his wife, and so she collected the pieces and then wrapped them in bandages and linen, and that caused him to become resurrected. And so the story of resurrection is central to Osiris. And here we have a couple more images related to the gods. On the left-hand side, we have Anubis. So as I mentioned before, Anubis replaced Osiris during, I believe, the Middle Kingdom. And on the right-hand side, we have a depiction of Hapi. After the Old Kingdom comes the Middle Kingdom. This is the period around the 11th and 12th dynasties. Between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom was a period of instability. And the Middle Kingdom brings about stability in Egypt again. During the Middle Kingdom, many of the pharaohs worked to try and help the lower class people. So it wasn't just about the upper class people, as in some dynasties. They really worked a bit more toward the lower classes. They began building pyramids again, but they also worked for public works, things like irrigation systems. But this period, there was a decline as well, and you have a group migrating in called the Hyksos. They sometimes say that they invaded, but also some historians are looking and saying that they migrated into the period or the area during this period and kind of took advantage of the weak rulers. They adapted to Egyptian rule, though, so it wasn't like they came in and changed everything. They kept the government structures, they kept the writing and the religion, But they introduced some important things such as horse-drawn chariots, which was a new weapon for the Egyptians, and bronze weapons, armor, and helmets. After the Middle Kingdom came the New Kingdom. This period lasted from around 1570 to around 1090 BCE. And as we said, during the Middle Kingdom period, the Hyksos took over Egypt. During the New Kingdom, the Egyptians took control back. They kicked out the Hyksos, and you had major figures coming up. One of the most important was one of the only female pharaohs in Egypt, Hatshepsut. And she was a figure, she was married to a pharaoh, he passed away, and their son was too young to rule. And so she ruled instead of him while he was too young. So she kind of held his spot. But she also kind of took control and kept him from being ruler for quite some time. Around 20 years she ruled. But during that period, because she was a woman, she had to fight for legitimacy. She also constructed many, many buildings, temples, things like that. But eventually her son did come to power, Thutmose III. And his big famous thing was that he led about 17 campaigns to expand the empire as far into Mesopotamia, is one of the areas that he expanded into. One thing about him, after he took control, he destroyed a bunch of his mom's statues and inscriptions. We're not sure if he's trying to erase her or to try and make himself seem more important to history, but that is one thing that he is known for. But not long after his reign, Egypt began to decline again, and pretty quickly. The last great period was considered to be under Ramses II. Ramses II also constructed a lot of buildings, including the Great Hall at Karnak and Abu Simbel in Nubia. However, after Ramses' rule, Egypt continued to decline, and the next period would see conquests by many different groups, the Libyans, Kush, the Assyrians, the Greeks, the Persians, and finally the Romans. As I mentioned, Ramses built one of the great preserved temples at Abu Simbel. Right here is an image of the outside of one of those temples where you can see 4 statues there. One of them has been slightly damaged and fallen. But this is one of the temples that he built. But it has a very interesting story. So here's another picture of one of the smaller temples. It's actually 2 temples. There's this larger one from the first picture, and now this second one here, which is slightly off a little ways from it. And finally, here we have an image of inside the temple. So if you go through that door that you see from one of the previous pictures, this is what the inside of that temple looks like. So as I mentioned, this temple has a very interesting history. So if you take a look at this picture, you can see that this temple is right on the banks of the Nile River. So that water you see there on the left-hand side of this picture, that's the Nile River. And back in the 1960s, Egypt decided that it wanted to construct a dam along the Nile River, the Aswan High Dam. When they built it, the problem is that this temple was going to be submerged. The flood waters that the dam would create would make this temple underwater. But as you can see here, this picture is not underwater. This temple is still above water. So what they did was really, really interesting. So if you look at this picture here, if you look in the bottom and left-hand side of the picture, you can see the temple that we just looked at. And then if you look up, you can see the temple again at the top of the picture and to the right of the picture. And there's kind of some plexiglass there to depict the river. So what happened was, in order to preserve this temple, they took the entire thing apart, lifted it up to the top of the ridge, and moved it over. So they cut the temple into large blocks and reconstructed the entire thing so that it would be preserved. That way, when the flood waters came through, it wouldn't be destroyed. So that was a very, very expensive process, but because they did that, we can still visit this ancient temple that was built by Ramses II. So we spent a lot of this time talking about the Egyptian society and culture, but right next door was the kingdom of Kush. It was located in the south of Egypt near the Third Cataract. Kush had strong trade relationships with Egypt throughout their entire history. Egypt looked to Kush to find things like gold, timber, and ivory. They also looked to them to provide slaves, either through conquest or purchase. Most people in Kush were farmers, so their big commodity was farming. Throughout Egyptian history, there was some strained relations here and there where Egypt tried to colonize Kush. Eventually, they were able to take over Kush, but eventually the tables turned and Egypt was able to be taken over by Kush, somewhere around the 25th dynasty. For the people who lived in Egypt, the civilization peaked at around 5 million Egyptian citizens. Most of these people lived in the Delta region where we had those crops that we talked about when we talked about geography. They were able to grow there because of the silt that the river brought with it during the flood season. Each person had a class or a role in society, and society was highly stratified. That means there's lots of layers. So you had layers at the top with the pharaoh and his family and high-level bureaucrats and priests and things like that. But most people were in the lower levels of society. Most people were poor peasants who farmed. And we've mentioned this before, most people throughout human history were farmers. The one thing about Egyptian society, though, was it was possible to move up in class. If you were a poor peasant, you could do things like join the military and move up in class that way. Or if you were able to go to a school to learn how to be a scribe, that would help you go up in class as well. In terms of women, women in Egyptian society had more rights than in other societies. So, for example, more rights than women in Greek or Roman society. Women could serve as priestesses in temples or musicians or gardeners. They shared a lot of the same legal rights and economic rights as men, so they could buy and sell property. If they got divorced, then women's property stayed with the women. So they did have more rights than in other civilizations. One of the final things we think about when we talk about Egyptian civilization is the idea of hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics are pictures and sound symbols that are used to create language. And so we saw a little bit of this as we looked at some of the pictures throughout the lecture. We had these images and writing on sarcophagus or on the walls of temples or in the pyramids. But one thing to remember is that most people in Egyptian society could not read or write. Scribes could read and write, but the average person could not. And also the thing to remember is that hieroglyphics, while they're very identifiable with Egypt, that was something that was preserved for things like temples and religious ceremonies and things related to the pharaoh. For everyday things, there was a script that was used to write down information, and usually this was written on papyrus. The picture at the top here with kind of the yellow-colored papyrus there, that is the script that I'm speaking of. Hieroglyphics, on the other hand, is the picture on the bottom. Those were carved into walls and on stone tablets and things like the pyramids. All right, thank you for joining us on our lecture on ancient Egypt and Kush.